Hi, I'm Telia,
And I'm Joshua.
and welcome to our podcast, The Uncommon Senses, where we reflect on the nature of knowledge and how we know what we claim to know. So, hi everyone. So, today we have a special episode where we continue our discussion on the theory of idealism, since it's such a fascinating and mind boggling theory. And we will talk it mainly through about a short story called The Ghosts. And so we won't do that rhetorical question opening today, and we will just have some further discussions on our belief systems. So let's just get right in. First, we will start with several literature examples, which questions about our common sense and argue that reality is constituted and made entirely by our minds, and the reality is basically just a mental construction. First one, we will bring out a pretty famous example, The Matrix. And I'm sure like many of us possibly know this, but I only watched the first movie. So essentially, it presents the world as a lie, and that us humans are actually some energy sources to some advanced machines, and yet we kind of experience normal human lives, and as our brain is being hooked to a simulated world. And this movie is a perfect illustration of idealism, which is a theory of reality that basically says that everything is an idea. I actually think the Matrix, I don't know, if it's like the producers or the directors, they were philosophy students. So that's great. And yeah, basically it states that everything is only in our minds. And for the things that we think are for sure real, such as, feeling pain and we're eating food, we feel, full, we feel hunger, or we are being able to see something, etc. That all of these feelings are just some simulation. It's kind of like a chemical signal sent to our brain, which gives us the illusion that we're feeling pain or our taste buds actually tasted something. So this is a fun illustration, like a sci-fi illustration of idealism. However, like what we previously mentioned in the last episode, the advantages and disadvantages of idealism, it can go very extreme, and there's definitely some real life situations that happened which has gone wrong. So yeah, Joshua, do you want to kind of like give us some examples on that?
Sure. So one of the examples that of idealism going wrong is religious cults, basically. One of the very infamous example is Heaven's Gate, which is a um, religious group that believes that humans could transcend into immortal beings by rejecting their human bodies, and this has actually led to several mass suicides in the 1970s and 1980s. And it just comes to show how one's jeopardy and well-being could be placed in jeopardy if we over rely on um, idealism and the idea that everything is in our minds. And another example is the People's Temple Agriculture Project, which is also a similar religious cult known for a very infamous case called Jonestown, in which a lot of people it also involves mass suicide, as well as several cases of murder, of which people have been poisoned or forcefully or forced to kill themselves because of a certain belief within their religion. And on one hand, this could show like the kind of potential harm in idealism, of which if your personal beliefs consume you, it could lead to morally ambiguous or outcomes that directly harms your self-interest and well-being. On the other hand, I don't know, who are we to judge? Like, perhaps they are correct. Perhaps like their religion does hold sway, and that we have no right in judging their ideas of what a reality is and how they choose to react to their own version of reality.
Yeah, right. I mean, the thing about idealism is that it gives you so much freedom to kind of like have explore your own reality, your own thoughts and your own ideas. And for sure, like those two very extreme cases is an example of when it went to the very extreme. And yeah, like what you mentioned, we will definitely later parts discuss about where do we draw that line, between, this is their way of, living, this is what they believed is right versus our moral standards. Yeah, like how do we judge between that? I think it's interesting, and it's definitely can be controversial and definitely up for debate. So we will talk about this in later parts. But I mean, aside from the Matrix, in our TOK lessons, we actually looked through a short story called The Ghost. I think it's actually in the TOK philosophy syllabus. No, not TOK philosophy, but it's in the IB philosophy syllabus. Not sure, but yeah, it's a short story called The Ghost, and it's an extract from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert M. Pirsig. Yeah, it's basically, I guess it's a short story collection. And maybe I should give you guys this like kind of short story summary. So basically, it depicts like a group of people at a camp, and they first were like kind of talking about ghost stories, and just like what most of our common senses tell us, the speaker of the story initially says like he doesn't believe in ghosts because it's unscientific, because there's no proof, and ghost also doesn't contain any matter and no energy. So according to natural sciences that we know, if something that doesn't contain matter and don't carry any energy, then they don't exist, and they're only in people's minds. They're only something that you think of, and you're made them up. However, the conversation kind of just starts to become weirder / more interesting from there, where the speaker actually suggests that these natural science, these scientific laws which we believe in, are also just like ghosts. That these laws, they have no matter, they have no energy, and they only hold because we just believe in them. And because like all of the things that we kind of believe in, they don't really exist by the definition of what existence is, of having matter and having energy. And in like the main speaker also in the story also says that these math laws, logic laws, gravitational laws, etc., are not discovered but are actually invented by us. And I mean, this is definitely it can be a whole new episode, a whole new debate on is math discovered or is math invented. But yeah, basically this person says like these laws that we kind of discover about them are kind of invented by us. And the speaker also raised the question that before the law of gravity has been discovered, is that law just sitting there somewhere with no mass and no energy on its own, not in anyone's minds? And has that law still existed? Because by the common sense definition of existence, this law doesn't even exist, not until it has been so-called, discovered. So it can't just be there somewhere and then suddenly it came into people's minds. So he's just saying that this is just before Newton thought about this. This law has never existed. And hence he believes that by arguing in the theory of idealism, the law is basically invented in people's minds. So yeah, like what we previously mentioned quite a lot in the episodes, like that thought experiment. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? So basically, applying this thought experiment to our case is that if the law has existed since the very beginning but no one knows it, then does this law actually exist? Because by arguing scientific realism and common sense realism, which we argue in terms of this rational thought where the reality is independent of the observer, then yes, this law has existed. But we think about this in the theory of idealism, where reality is completely dependent on what we observe, also with phenomenalism, then this law has never existed. So basically, this is just kind of what this whole story is about. And of course, the main moral of the story isn't really telling us to not believe in science, but the story is kind of like an illustration of the theory of idealism, and perhaps also telling us to keep an open mind to other ideas and theories that are equally valid, because the story kind of states that, to a lot of indigenous people, these ghosts, they are just as real as, atoms and, all these science theories to us. So from this whole story, I think there are several points that we can possibly discuss. And, the first one is basically the speaker points out that many scientists say that ghosts only exist in your minds and they aren't real. However, science is also only in our minds too, and it's just a system that we choose to believe in. So why does science has to be put in a separate category that holds more sway and more power and are considered more trusted and reliable? So yeah, Joshua, what do you think about this speaker's idea? What do you think about his thought that, science is just in our minds and, it's by the theory of idealism is kind of invented. What do you think about this?
Yes, I think as we've mentioned in previous episodes, I think what he says is definitely very valid because as we've seen before, scientific realism is rooted in empirical evidence, and as we've gone through before, empirical evidence is not always rock solid. There is limitations and there is its own fallibility to it. So because scientific realism is ultimately based on something that is so fickle or volatile, I think it would be correct to say that it is science to a certain extent is really dependent on external conditions as well as dependent on how we interpret it and our own process of rationalizing it. So I would say that scientific realism is kind of a mesh between phenomenalism as well as common sense realism, of which it uses evidence from both in trying to create a generalized view of the world. And because these two different types of reality is ultimately have their own disadvantages and their own limitations. So I would say that although scientific realism is responsible for a lot of, as you've mentioned, marvelous and amazing discoveries that we have made as humanity, but it is ultimately not a all-encompassing and not a perfect form of reality in the sense that it does have its own shortcoming, and we ought to be really careful when trying to maneuver scientific reality as a form of realism, because it's very easy to really put too much trust in it, or perhaps form your entire perception of reality around it, despite it having its own limitations. And I think to really be able to have an accurate grasp of what reality is, we must acknowledge these limitations and not be blind to these shortcomings in order to really form a comprehensive or holistic idea of what constitutes as a reliable form of reality.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Especially we keep talking about how science is actually not that rigid, but it's volatile as we progress and as we discover more things. Because if you think about it, before our modern society kind of generally believed in natural sciences, we used to have all of these myths and kind of stories, which is what we regard as now, or even religious institutions that kind of had explained how this world works. So these so-called not so reliable belief systems, which we describe now, will hold just as much power as science that we have today, back in a few centuries ago. So who knows? Maybe in the future we'll all worship this civilization that created our simulated world and discovered more of their science laws. By the simulation hypothesis, which you can definitely research it and see our previous episodes that we've also talked about it. So yeah, basically I think just what the story has talked about, for those people who believe in indigenous knowledge systems, their ghosts, and these spiritual things are just as real as atoms and particles are to a modern man. So yeah, what we previously talked about, I think just really keep an open mind to different theories and different belief systems by other people. And, we've been talking about, natural sciences. However, I think this can definitely apply to different fields as well. Even in the 21st century, we see that many of us have very different belief systems on how we view the world. And like the perfect example is possibly politics, among different communities. We see that people have become like, very strong and dogmatic with their opinions. And I think there are cases where some people think that their thoughts are more superior. I'm not going to state which communities I think, but yeah, I mean, this can definitely apply to everyone, right? Like every single community, I think we all believe that we got the right knowledge system, we have the right views on politics. However, why do some people think like certain beliefs are stupid and some things aren't? Because all of them are just in our minds, and they're all kind of based on our, not just related to the theory of idealism, but also phenomenalism. Like a lot of things that we believe, especially in politics, a lot of them possibly derive from our personal experiences. So yeah, I just personally think that this short story, even though it mainly focuses on natural sciences, which is somewhat regarded as one of the ones that is more objective ways of knowing, areas of knowledge. However, I think in so many different fields, we can also see that, there's definitely different rooms for us to discover more and to be open-minded to other different ideas. So, yeah, that's kind of like our first point of discussion for this short story. And I think the second possible point that we can discuss about is, just now we spent a lot of time talking about how the modern natural science is the belief system that has more power and is redeemed to be more reliable and hence holds more truth. So in that story, it also explains why most of us subscribe to the modern natural science that we know of and made an extremely bold claim. When in the short story, when another character asks the speaker, why does everyone believe in the laws of science? The speaker actually compares modern education with mass hypnosis. So basically, he talks about how we believe in science because we're taught that it is right. So, yeah, Joshua, what do you think about that statement? Comparing modern education with mass hypnosis. I think in the previous episode, I did mention about, I do think like science, natural science, it holds more power because it's very useful and it has helped our society progress so much more. But, compare modern education with mass hypnosis, what do you think about that?
I think it reminds me of this discussion we have in history lesson, of which we debated on the definition of indoctrination. So what constitutes indoctrination? What is, the idea of brainwash? We always use this term nowadays, but what does it actually mean? So to a lot of people, they would think that it is the form of education where the educator will push a certain agenda onto the educatees, like the person receiving the education. But if you think, I think in terms of TOK, I think it brings up another point is that to what extent when they're talking about like science, or they're talking about these really fixed way of knowing, or these so-called knowledge that we can't be 100% sure of, to what extent does that also constitute as a form of, as you said, mass hypnosis or indoctrination, of which we are led to believe that these are truths despite we don't have absolute certainty in? And to what extent can education exist, coexist with uncertainty? So as we have mentioned in earlier episodes, we can't be certain of absolutely everything, because the only thing that we can really be certain of is the existence of our minds, and that's not really, that only forms a really little part of our, system of knowledge. So to what extent does education can coexist with this uncertainty, and to what extent can we be uncomfortable with this uncertainty and to be certain of the knowledge that we hold? So I think this is definitely a very contentious issue, and personally speaking, I tend to be more to have a more open-minded approach to it, in the sense that despite it's very important for us to gain our to gain knowledge and in the conventional sense, in terms of science, mathematics, literature, humanities, and so on. I think we should always keep an eye out for the limitations of these knowledge, and especially when we're trying to apply this knowledge to like real life scenarios. For example, in medicine, or in when we talk about, for example, law, or like other real life applications, it's very important to keep these limitations in mind, so to not create some fatal mistakes in, so not to buy into some of the flawed or logical fallacies, so to speak. So, responding to your question, I think it is very despite which is, I'm not telling people to not go to schools or to completely reject our current educational system. I think they must at least acknowledge there are limitations to it, and must always keep an eye out for potential disparities with what they view as reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, speaking of the education system, I believe we can make a whole episode just talking about it.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think it's always trash. I think as we will be so privileged to say that education is trash. Like, there are people who want to have it and they don't have even to have that opportunity. But there is definitely flaws in our education system. And I personally, my response to this question is like, I feel like mass hypnosis is kind of making you unable to really think or have a mind on your own. It kind of like a lot of, cults as well. And I think education, the main purpose of it is really to allow you to train, how to think independently. And hopefully that's what we're doing in our podcast. So, yes. So anyway, we can definitely talk about the, flaws of education and how we think about this in the future. But yeah, I think a very interesting point that this one has made is like, we believe in science because we're taught that it is right. It kind of relates to a point which I've raised in episode 0 about astrology. It's like absolute opposites of science. And my mom, she really likes to buy crystals and their energy. And we're not like, hardcore into this, I would believe this, but we think it's interesting. So that's why we're like buying crystals and like, and apparently like, different crystals, they have different energy. There's some like transparent or white crystals. Apparently it's for concentration. And there's pink ones that are for, romance and love. There's blue ones that are for communication. And, interesting thing, when I have the white crystal bracelet on, which my mom told me is about concentration, I feel more concentrated. It might be the effect of the crystal itself, or just my psychological, thing that I... yeah, basically. Whatever. And yeah, I remember one time I was playing around the crystals with my friends. And this is what my mom taught us. Like, you can put the crystal bracelet on your palm between your two hands, and you move your upper hand in a circular motion, and you can like really kind of feel some sort of movement, some sort of like, energy, magnetic field of the crystals. Once again, it can be completely imaginary, but I just feel like I felt something. And the thing is, we're kind of more skeptical towards astrology or these kind of crystal things. Because like there's a lack of proof that there are any spiritual things or something, people just think, oh, it's illogical, there's no proof that this is real. And however, when you see like a lot of people, that they kind of go to psychic readings and they possibly have discovered like a new side of themselves, or people who they cared about pass away and they have a connection with them, and they get a sense of closure and healing. Or when I was wearing the bracelet, I really feel like I was more concentrating. I think some examples of the psychic one is from like a Try Guys video where they're meeting Tyler the medium. So the guys were initially quite skeptical, but afterwards they feel like they really have a connection with the family members that have passed away. And I guess regardless of whether this psychic thing is real or not, I guess the emotional connection must have been very important for these people who went to these readings. And possibly that's one of the powers of astrology, which is to kind of give them a new outlook on life. And honestly, it can be really fun. And honestly, this really made me think, like, do we kind of judge astrology more because it's somewhat regarded as a witchcraft? And witchcraft we relate it to like a woman's field, and hence it's less valuable for the society. Or do we really, believe in something because it has an actual solid proof? Like, if astrology has no real scientific proofs, then it's regarded as less valid or powerful. So this somewhat brings me to this whole patriarchal society idea, because science is like a men's field. It was dominated by men, and hence it holds more sway. But for something like astrology, which is somewhat regarded as previously the witches do it, it's spiritual, or it only has a connection with the emotional aspect of a person, then it's somewhat regarded as less valid and powerful. So yeah, Joshua, what do you think about our views on these ideas, and potentially how do you think this may relate to the society that we're living in, which affects how we view different fields and see them with a more skeptical perspective or not?
I think ultimately what COK teaches us is that we must always keep a open mind to all these different types of ideas. So as we've gone through like this in this episode, I know we may sound very anti-science, so to speak. We seem like we're poking flaws in a system that scientists and people in history has spent years and decades trying to perfect, but it is not our intention. We're not trying to bring down the entire scientific system or the entire educational system, but we're simply trying to point out that these things that people seems to think is a given. So they think that scientific is reliable. That's a given fact. That is a that seems to form the new truth in our secular society today. But we're just trying to say that there is other perspectives that could argue that these truths may not be as reliable as we think, and completely disregarding these kind of limitations will be unrealistic, and also it won't do the system justice. So we're just trying to provide another point of view. And I would like to point out the idea that the mass hypnosis, the idea of a mass hypnosis kind of also points out the idea of public good versus the respect for individuality. So we look at the history of education. Education really came into as a field of study in Victorian England when people started to it started from the middle class trying to promote, to increase the overall quality of humanity and society by trying to raise moral standards and also trying to raise the literacy rate within the country. So we can see that, the standardization of education is not a bad thing initially. They're trying to create a standardized system to benefit the public good equally across society. But as education evolve and so on, we start to see some limitations and some shortcomings of it, in the sense that this kind of standardization also presents itself as kind of rigidity in ossifying people's thoughts and people's stands. And we see a lot of problems today in terms of people being really stubborn and really determined to prove that they're right, based on these standardized education and based on these educational systems that has been set in place long ago. So I think in recent years we have a newfound respect for individuality, of which we start to appreciate and as well as acknowledge that other points of view exist in the world, and a truth can be multifaceted. It does not present itself in one form, but rather it could, different fields or different beliefs could have some resemblance of truth in itself, and also provides persuasive argument in its own right. So I believe that education itself is not inherently bad. It's just that it does as of all things, it has its advantages as well as its shortcomings. And as you mentioned, like in recent years, there's like the anti-vax movement, and also like the um like like flat earthers and all that kind of things. So I think, culturally speaking, there is a discussion regarding to what extent should we allow individuality, and to what extent should we respect the opinion of others if that opinion could affect the well-beings of those around the person. So as we've mentioned
Yeah.
before, there are like cults that perhaps perpetuate harmful ideas such as mass
Mm.
suicide, or perhaps some cults may promote human sacrifice. These kind of ideas that are morally frowned upon. So to what extent do we respect their culture, and to what extent do we say as a modern society that these kinds of behavior have to stop, and we must protect the people involved in these kind of harmful thinking? I think this is there's no correct answer, and the line is very blurry, and I think it leaves a lot of room for discussion in this sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, yeah, like, I guess just once again, one last disclaimer is that we're really not saying that you shouldn't believe in science, but we really do hope that you can keep an open mind on ideas that, seem to be absurd to you at first glance, and know that these different, you know, areas of knowledge can coexist together, and you don't have to, see them, oh, this clearly has a clash, hence the other one is wrong. Like, you don't have to really see the world in that particular way. And really, to respond to what you mentioned about, anti-vaxxers or flat earthers, is honestly, we've been talking about we should keep an open mind on things, but like, yeah, to what extent should we keep an open mind to other things when we have people like anti-vaxxers, flat earthers believing in things that are clearly wrong, and are clearly harmful as well, like the cults that you just mentioned about. And also, I think for me personally, there's this fine line between where should we draw that line between respecting a culture that we think is kind of inhumane or unethical, and where should we step in to stop them and prevent this from happening? Like, respecting cultures versus our own morals standards. So I guess I got two examples that I think we can possibly talk about. The first one is, in the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a lot of people, this whole huge value of individuality in a lot of Western cultures, and made them reluctant to wear a mask. And, there are many people that have died because of this no mask culture, and people got infected with COVID. However, I think the world just thinks it's quite all right. However, in some cultures where child marriage is allowed and is deemed to be ethical and is, part of their lifestyle and culture, and, to what extent should we intervene with it and protect these young girls? And, to what extent should we just kind of do nothing about it because it's part of their culture? This actually reminds me of like a short story collection called Stories of the Sahara by San Mao. And basically, she went to Sahara and then she witnessed, child marriage. And she chose to respect the culture. However, in her story, she expressed her disagreement towards this practice. So she thinks this practice is unethical, however, she still chose to respect it. So, yeah, like, Joshua, what do you think about where should we draw the line between respecting a culture versus stepping in because we believe is immoral?
To me personally, I think the bottom line is that human rights, and also like the well-being of the individuals involved has to be prioritized. I think practices that actively harm individuals and actively causes harm to their physical or mental well-being should be discouraged, at least, or trying to put a stop to it. But I realize that this stance is very contentious on its own, because as you've said, as like in a lot of modern commentaries by China has said that we shouldn't we shouldn't use human rights as an excuse to kind of
Mm.
overlap the rights of other countries or certain communities. And certainly human rights is itself in itself a very volatile and fallible definition, because there is no concrete definition of what constitutes as human rights. Human rights in one culture may differ from another, and again, what right do we have to impose our version of human rights on other communities? So I think this is definitely a very an area that has no solid answer and open for discussion. But personally speaking, from how I was brought up and my perception of reality, is that I don't think that practices that actively harms the mental and psychological well-being of others should be allowed, at least in the civilized or modern society that we live in today.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's totally right, especially point on like human rights itself. Because, yeah, in my ethical course in university, we talk about right-based ethical theories, which is proposed by John Locke, that humans we are born with inseparable human rights. But, like, what are those rights? In different cultures, those rights are very different. So going back to child marriage, yeah, are we really standing in like high ground of like moral standards and judging others' culture for child marriage? So personally, I also disagree with child marriage. I think it is wrong. However, like what San Mao did, I think if I ever witnessed it, I would possibly choose to respect their culture. And it definitely happened in Hong Kong as well. I think in our Chinese lessons in IB, like we were talking about their ethnic minority communities in Hong Kong, which a young girl possibly just somewhat just disappeared in the class, and because like her family arranged a marriage for her, but then she's only like 13 or something. Yeah, I think it's definitely up for debate, like how do we draw that line between whether we should say something or whether we should just kind of respect it. And it also depends on different cultures. Kind of like I think we tend to, and like in this world that's quite Western centric, like I think we tend to be more judgy and skeptical towards cultures that are non-Western, and then we think that ours, the Western one, is the right one, that we should all go in a line for that. So yeah, I feel like this is definitely an interesting discussion, and I think there's no right or wrong to this question. And yeah, so for our entire podcast, we just kind of want to let you know that there isn't, in our discussion on idealism, that there isn't an absolute right or absolute wrong in anything. And then we should always keep an open mind to ideas that we think are kind of absurd at the first glance, and try to understand this and discuss about it. However, you can also have your own judgments and your own standards on where you draw the line between keeping open-minded and really just saying that this behavior is wrong, this is morally wrong, I'm not going to agree with you on this. I think all of us possibly have very, very different interpretations on that. And yeah, I guess this is what this episode is about. So some recommended literature things that I think you guys can check out is, first of all, of course, The Matrix, and then The Ghost short story, and Stories of Sahara by San Mao. And I also have one which is called The Egg by Andy Weir. Anyway, I will put that in the description. It's not included in the podcast, but I think it's quite an interesting story. So yeah, thank you guys so much for listening to your podcast, and we'll see you next time on The Uncommon Senses.